Welcome to Faith Imperfect with Jessica. This is the season finale of The Chosen Season 1, Episode 8. It's called I Am He. And today I have both of my sisters with me. My friend Cindy was going to join us, but her plans changed. So welcome, Jennifer and Janice.
Hello.
All right, so we're really excited to be recording today. I'm going to just go ahead and start with the recap, and they'll jump in as we go along. So the very beginning scene, it reads, Cana, 1952 BC, and there's a man and his sons that are establishing a camp. They're starting to dig for a well, and you learn that the man's name is Jacob, and a visitor approaches and warns him that they were sold land that wouldn't produce anything, that it's worth nothing. He says that they, as foreigners, were cheated in the sale, and he says that they're never going to find water for the well that they're digging. And I looked up, this is from Genesis 33, verses 18 through 20. It says that Jacob bought the plot of land from the sons of Hamor, where he pitched his tent and set up an altar. So Jacob tells this visitor in The Chosen that they will not be staying long because they're traveling to a land that God promised his grandfather Abraham. The visitor starts asking questions about Jacob's God. What's his name? Where's your temple? Where's the place you worship? And then he asks him things like, you don't carry him with you? And Jacob says that they don't carry God with them and they can worship anywhere they go. And he tells the man that God is invisible except the time that he broke his hip. And the man's like, you chose a God that is invisible and broke your hip? And then the sons call Jacob over to where they're digging, and you see water bubbling up, and he tells the visitors that they didn't choose God. God chose them.
Yeah, I thought this was an interesting scene because I was actually trying to find it in the Bible, and I couldn't find where he was building the well. So I was surprised when you said it was in Genesis because I searched that Bible app, and the only mention of the well was in John. So I will have to check back on those verses and just take a look at that. That's interesting. I'll make a note of it.
Yeah, I can quickly go over like Genesis 32. 32 verses 22 through 32 is Jacob wrestling with God. So it talks about there's a night that Jacob got up and took his wives and his female servants and his 11 sons, and they crossed a ford. And after he sent everybody across the stream and all his possessions, he was by himself. And a man wrestled him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he couldn't overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched and wrestled with the man. And the man said, let me go, for it's daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not unless you bless me. And the man asked him, what's your name? And he said, Jacob. And then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. So it goes on to say that Jacob, he realized he was wrestling with God and his life was spared. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites don't eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. I thought it was kind of interesting. I thought I had a note about that too. That's not about the well, but that was, I think, before the well. And so that's the story, like the backstory to this wrestling with God. And I thought I read something where it said that when he was wrestling with the man, like God was in a form that the guy could wrestle him. And that's why God just finally touched his hip and broke it or dislodged it or something.
Yeah, because it never really explained when he was telling the other man that his hip was broke. It didn't really explain like how that happened. So that's interesting to know the backstory on it. I felt like at the beginning of this episode, I almost felt like it started out kind of confrontational between him and the other man. Like the other man didn't want to hear anything about like his God and...
Well, he did make a comment that that's not a place of peace. So he was already kind of on guard. Additionally, I thought it was interesting when he said how much he bought the land for. Of course, I had to research currency and I could not find that currency anywhere because I was curious how much that would have translated in our money. But it appears that Kasah, however they pronounced it, doesn't appear to be a biblical currency that I couldn't research anywhere on the internet. But maybe it's somewhere, but it wasn't anywhere I looked.
I do kind of wonder in those days, if it's so far back that a lot of people were trading, could people be making up their own money too? The other verse with Jacob purchasing the plot, it wasn't necessarily digging the well, but Jacob purchasing that plot of land. It just says that Jacob came from Paddan Aram. He arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver he bought from the sons of Hamor, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. There he set up an altar and called it by another name that I can't pronounce. So it actually does not talk about the well, but it talks about him buying that land from the sons. So then the next scene, you see a woman raising a bucket from inside the well. It's middle of the day. She's struggling. She fills 2 clay jars and then carries them on her shoulder, kind of like in a shoulder yoke. I was trying to look like what it would be called, because it's across one shoulder. She's carrying the heavy load into town, and when she sets it down, she enters a house. And the man inside does not seem happy. He makes a comment about wishing that the person entering there was going to put him out of his misery. And then you discover that the woman is married to the man in the house. He asks her why her hair is disheveled and her face is red, and he tells her that she can come back and live with him, and then she'd be able to go to the well with the other women in the morning when it's cool. She tells him she could have with Ramin, but not him. It's insinuated that Ramin maybe was her first husband. She asks her husband to sign a bill of divorce, and he tells her, which in the series they're calling her Photina, he tells her that only a man can divorce his wife, not the opposite. He tells her he won't sign the paper, and when she says please, he tosses it in the fire. He tells her that she is his property and that he doesn't part lightly with his possessions.
I was just going to say that my mouth dropped open when they panned out and had to show how far she had to walk with that water. Because I've been to Arizona visiting and been up on the mountain and have seen a far distant city and have walked a part of it. And I could only imagine what that was like with those 2 giant, kind of like ceramic urns almost, attached to that shoulder yoke, as you called it. You take running water for granted when you see this kind of stuff.
And I was going to say the same thing. Not only were they like ceramic jugs, but then they're full of water, and she's got 2 of them, and she's carrying them all the way back down the hill into her town. Yeah, I couldn't imagine that. The other thing I wanted to say about that scene was my jaw dropped when I heard her husband telling her, "You are my property." And again, I have to keep remembering of how things were back in the day. I don't think women would stand for that now if they were told they were somebody's property. But yeah, I just found that very interesting. He treats her like she's property and not a woman.
That stood out to me because I always felt like marriage started back when marriage started as a way to combine assets. And usually a woman came with a dowry or land or whatever, and she was property. And that's one of the whole reasons why I've always kind of had a little thing with marriage myself, because I feel like nowadays women are still getting married and then they take the man's name, which is what they did when it first started, to show property, like the man owns you, you take his name. And so that was kind of always something that stuck in my craw, even in modern weddings, personally, for myself.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, my only 2 comments, just to go back to the heat real quick. I did watch a sermon from a church down south, and he was talking about this story, and he was saying that he had been to that area as a tourist, and that they're used to the heat down south for June, July, August, and I forgot how he referred to them, but that it's pretty darn hot in the south, and that this heat was like so much worse than that heat. So on top of that, you got the heat in addition to the weight of that yoke, the containers, the water, the distance. And then as far as like getting married, I feel like I'm all about women power. I know there's parts in the Bible where like the man is the head of the household, but there are parts also where the man is supposed to honor the woman as well. So the next scene, you see all the apostles and others. So there's extra people we haven't met yet, eating at a long banquet table. Matthew's standing in the back, and he's getting grapes and things to serve the others. Everyone is talking and laughing. Simon seems unhappy to be there. There's like something with his face. People are laughing. He's really not joining in on the laughing. Matthew's offering grapes to everyone. And when he offers them to Simon's like, no. So I feel like he's very standoffish in this scene. And then while a few of them are talking about how Matthews is handsome when he's not standing behind iron bars, which I assume they mean his tax booth, you hear someone say, "What's going on?" And then you see 2 Pharisees at the gate at Matthew's house. One of them is Yusuf, which I guess I've been calling Joseph, but it's Yusuf. And then Matthew opens the gate and he asks if he can help them. Jesus offers for them to come in and join, and then they say they would never be caught. And that Jesus says, what, in a tax collector's house? And Yusuf says, not only that, but and he's gesturing and kind of pointing to the people and doesn't finish his sentences. So Simon says something like, you seem to be having a hard time with your words. And then Yusuf says, why does your master eat with the tax collectors and sinners? So Jesus responds with, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Yusuf says that he's shocked. She, kind of pointing to Mary, is from the Red Quarter, and he makes a comment that things that go on there are so unholy that if he spoke of them, he would defile himself. And Simon makes a joke like it sounds like a personal problem, which I kind of laughed. Yusuf says how him, Matthew, and the others that he works with betray their people for money, and they're not even sorry. The two Pharisees say how they never offer a guilt sacrifice at the temple, that their records show it, and then Matthew immediately defends that the tax collectors aren't allowed at the temple. Jesus says, you're forgetting the scroll of Hosea. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy more than sacrifice. And that's from Hosea 6:6. Yusuf says that there are righteous men watching or weighing every word that Jesus says. And then Jesus says, tell them this, I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. And then Gaius shows up and asks if everything is under control. The two Pharisees say yes, and that they were just leaving.
I thought it was interesting to see Matthew as an excited host, fussing over the grapes and offering stuff. I'm picking up Simon's attitude as he is not pleased that Matthew was asked to follow Jesus. And that was where his attitude was coming in, and just not on board with it at all. When they mentioned the Red Quarter, wasn't really sure what that meant, and it wasn't in the Bible. I think the Red Quarter was a term that the show made for the show's purposes. But I do know from songs, movies, whatever, that usually red is associated with evil and evil things, or maybe things that's, would be more sinful, let's say. And so I can kind of guess what they were trying to get at there. The last thing I'll say about it is that when they were walking away, the captioning called the other older man that was with Yusuf Nicodemus in the captioning. But I looked at it, I double checked, and I paused it, and that was not Nicodemus. So that was very interesting that I saw that the caption said Nicodemus sighs, and then he makes a statement, but I was so distracted by the fact that they called him Nicodemus on the caption that, yeah, I had to really, really look at that because that confused me.
Jessica, I had a question because obviously, and I don't know if Jennifer has been watching the series from the beginning. So did the director ever say why he called the Red Quarter the Red Quarter? I know this is kind of jumping back.
I don't think so. I don't remember seeing it, but I think she's right, because I think I heard it a couple other times, like when they were like, there's a disturbance in the Red Quarter. Remember, I think that's when they first asked Nicodemus to go help Lilith. I think they referred to it as the Red Quarter. So yeah, I just assume they're talking about kind of like the Red District, or I think it's just something they're calling it, but they never really talked about that.
Right. Well, and I was kind of curious because I think even in this last episode, something was mentioned about the East Ghetto, which I thought was very interesting because you wouldn't think that back in the day they would have used a word like ghetto. So I'm wondering if the Red Quarter was also known as the ghetto where bad things happen. Just something I was thinking about when I was listening to it.
That is probably what they're just trying to insinuate, that it's a bad area, maybe.
Well, also, I feel like the director or just the show creators, I feel like they wanted to make it more relatable, because I'll notice when they approach each other, they're like, hey, I could just not see that back in the day that was the greeting that they did. And just some of the words that they use, especially Simon, there was a couple of things that he said in previous episodes where I'm like, that seems a little like modern terminology, really, when you think about it. And I could see that they're probably just trying to modernize the terminology, the conversation, to make it more appealing to younger people and people who maybe might be turned off, so to speak, of biblical words and speakings of sorts.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, because they are adding stuff too, and I think it all is to make it relatable. I think that's a good point. And I think that the words might not have been used then, but they're just trying to convey that that's what they're trying to portray. So they're using modern language to say ghetto or quarter or whatever, because you don't see that stuff like you said in the Bible. So I just was going to mention that in Matthew 9:9 is when Jesus calls Matthew from the booth and says, "Follow me." In 10, it says, while Jesus is having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with the tax collectors and the sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners." So that whole section is in the Bible. They don't go on to say that he's calling out Mary or he's calling out any of the other people, but just mainly sinners and tax collectors. So in the scene, after that happens, and the two Pharisees say yes, that they were just leaving when Gaius shows up, Matthew excuses himself. He goes outside the gate and he talks with Gaius. Gaius tells him that he's making a mistake. Matthew says he's made his choice. Gaius says that other than the two who are law-abiding tax collectors in that group that he's with the dregs of Capernaum, the bottom of the barrel. Matthew tried to quiet him, and Matthew tells him that his Germanic ancestors surrendered and that Matthew is surrendering too. Matthew tells him that he will do well even without Matthew. So they go back and forth a little bit about Gaius's promotion. Gaius finally says that he only got the promotion due to Matthew. Matthew says that you can say thank you, and when Gaius says that he won't do that, Matthew tells him, well, if you're not going to say thanks, maybe there's something you can do to show your thanks. So he even offers to pay Gaius for whatever favor he's going to ask. Gaius turns him down for payment, but says, "What's the favor?" And that's where that scene ends.
I just got the feeling like Gaius is missing Matthew and the relationship. They must have had some sort of a bond, a weird kind of a friendship. It just seemed like Gaius was trying to talk him into going back to the booth.
I totally agree with everything Jennifer just said. I felt the same exact way.
Yeah, there's times that I wondered if he was doing it just to protect Matthew, because there was times when I first started watching it thinking, oh, is Quintus going to have him killed? Or is Quintus mad that he left? But then as we'll see more into the scene in this episode, you see other aspects where you feel like they must have had some kind of bond. So the next scene, Nicodemus is talking with his wife, Sahara. She's saying that Nicodemus never practiced his speech for her. And actually, at the beginning of this scene, I forgot that I had a note that it seemed to me like Nicodemus was deep in prayer and contemplation when she first walked into the scene, and that she interrupted what he was doing. And all of her talk in this scene was about like pride, family, their possessions. The entire time she's helping Nicodemus put on items and scents, and she's combing his facial hair and stuff like that. It seems like maybe he was contemplating giving it all up, but everything she was saying and doing was enforcing it for him, that he likes all his worldly things. And he tells Zahara that his mother always liked Hagar and liked her story, because Hagar was always caught up in something complicated and unpleasant and not by choice. God knew her and that her path would be difficult. And then Zahara makes a comment like, well, God's always there to comfort us. And then Nicodemus says, or call us. So the story of Hagar is actually in Genesis 16. I'm not going to go through that whole thing, but if somebody wanted to read it, it's in there. Zahara in this scene also mentions that it's their last day in Capernaum. Nicodemus almost seems anxious when he realizes that it is their last day. Zahara tells him that she loves her life, and he says he does too, after all these things I was saying about she's bringing up all their things that they have. And she tells him, I want you to take me home. And you can tell that he's upset. So then all of a sudden he's like, well, leave. I'm going to work on my speech. But he almost seems choked up. And I wonder if it's because he's still contemplating from what we saw in the last episode where Jesus says, follow me.
Yeah, I interpreted that as a very big struggle. And the story that he tells his wife about Hagar and the saying that he saw in the kitchen, or I don't know what room it was, but I felt like he was trying to relay to her his personal feelings, but she was just missing home and everything that she was used to so much that it was kind of falling on deaf ears, and he's really struggling between being an older man who's probably too old maybe to follow around on the road and really just wanting to follow him. And I found it to just be such an interesting storyline that was added to the series, because I think you've even mentioned before that part of that's not biblical.
Yeah, I never saw in that scene of them at night. When you read the Bible story, I don't believe he asks Nicodemus to follow him. He's just trying to explain the whole born again, and Nicodemus is trying to understand it. And they talk about the wind and Holy Spirit and all that stuff. But I did read another story that's in the Bible, but they say it's not the story of Nicodemus. There's a story of like a rich man where he goes to Jesus and says, how do I get to the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus mentions, give up your belongings and follow me. And you can tell in the story, the man is upset. He's sad because, long story short, I guess out of all the things that he mentions, like he talks about all the commandments, the one that Jesus doesn't bring up is coveting, and I guess that's the man's biggest sin. It was something in my study Bible that I read, and I thought it was really interesting. I was like, oh, I almost feel like maybe they used pieces of that story, but instead of that man, they put it onto Nicodemus to try to use that story in here. They never talked about it that way, but that's kind of how I interpret it, because Nicodemus has all these nice things, all these possessions, and he'd have to give all that up to follow Jesus. And I think that that's what they're saying, that that's the stuff that would get in the way, um, I guess, of his faith or of him following, that he just doesn't want to give up those worldly things.
Well, and I just wanted to say, and I know that you and Jennifer both kind of said this, so I don't want to just repeat it, but I felt like too that the conversation that Nicodemus was having with his wife, Zahara, that he seemed to really be struggling. And then he had a very worried look on his face when he realized that this was the last day that they were going to be there. And you could tell, just like you guys said, again, I'm reiterating it, I guess, that he seems stuck between, does he follow Jesus or does he go home with his wife? And I feel bad for him because I like the character, Nicodemus. I liked him from the very beginning. And I feel like he's a good man. And he's really struggling with these decisions.
Yeah, and it's almost like by his wife saying that they got one day, it's like, oh, I need to make my mind up, right? It's kind of almost how you take it too when you
Right.
watch it. All right, well, the next scene, you see a line of soldiers passing Quintus in Quintus's office or in the building they're in. Quintus stops Gaius and says he's been waiting to see him. Quintus tells Gaius that they are not using enough force with mobs, that they've never seen anyone trampled. He goes on to tell Gaius about Herod's envoy being delayed due to the mob in the street. At some point, he says like Silvius or something, and I looked it up, and I think that he just meant Herod, the childhood friend rival that he was talking to Matthew about. So Quintus tells Gaius that Matthew's tip about showing Herod his plan for infrastructure was very helpful. However, he goes on to say that when Herod's envoy was delayed, he had to endure a very smug lecture by Herod. Quintus is not happy that this happened. So Quintus then notices that Matthew is not with Gaius. He assumes that Gaius found a replacement to watch Matthew's booth, and he referred to him as our little friend. And Gaius says that a new soldier has been trained, and he's reviewing applications for a new publicanus for Matthew's district. So Quintus is confused, and then Gaius goes on to tell him that Matthew quit to become a student to follow the holy man from the eastern ghetto. And then Quintus is mad, and he says, I really don't like that man. So there you go. That's where we hear the eastern ghetto another time.
Yeah, I thought the vein in his forehead was going to burst when Quintus said that. And he reminds me of somebody. I can't quite put my finger on who he reminds me of, but yeah, I thought it was interesting that he wanted them, I believe, the mounted soldiers, is that what he called them, to trample people and show more force. I thought, wow, that would be one way of scaring people to keep into keeping the peace.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think any of that is in the Bible. I think it's for the show and probably for dramatic effect.
I did want to mention, I don't know if you girls agree with me, but the voice of Quintus, I don't even know how to explain it. He has the perfect voice for this character. Help me out. You guys know what I'm
Like a
thinking
villain?
here. Almost, yes. But it's like so deep and
It
so matter of fact.
Yeah.
I love his character as well.
I do, even though it's kind of a mean character. I like it. And then what's really hilarious, and I'll give you a chance to say something, Jennifer, because I can tell you got something to say. There's these things at work. It's going to be completely off topic, but these little shows we have to watch at work that are about IT and about the computer, and he's in them. But I only knew because they never showed the guy's face. You just hear the voice, and I was like, I know who that is. And then later they actually show his silhouette, and I'm like, it is him, because you could see the shiny head because he doesn't have hair. And I don't know if they shaved it or what, but he's got absolutely no hair. So it is him that's in this series that's, I forget what they're calling it, the Inside Man. I don't know if that's something you can find online, but if you Google the Inside Man episodes, he's like the villain in that's trying to steal these people's network, and he's got a man on the inside and he's trying to give him orders. So it's just kind of funny. His voice is very recognizable. And so when you said that, I was like, I got to talk about the Inside Man.
I must know him from somewhere too. But when you said villain, yes, it's like he's got this calm, villainous voice, but he's got these facial expressions that are like if daggers could shoot out of his eyeballs. So yeah, he's perfect for this role, and the perfect addition to add tension, like the creator of the show wanted to do.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that.
Okay, so the next scene is a short scene. You see Jesus and the apostles breaking down the camp. James and John say that they brought food for their 6-day trip. Jesus says they're only going to be 3 days. People at the camp are asking Simon why he's so quiet, and he says he's just excited. Jesus tells him, "Tell me the truth." And Simon tells him, "Are you telling me that you don't know what's already in my head?" And Jesus says that that's a conversation for another time. Simon says he is the only one that's married, and Eden is alone with her Ema. So that's where that scene ends. So it's a short little scene, but that already kind of tells you that Jesus has got different plans than what they all know about, knowing too that they're going to be traveling only 3 days instead of 6. The next scene, you see Nicodemus. He's all dressed up in his garb. He's anxiously waiting, and he's holding a small felt-looking bag, and he's fidgeting with it. Yusuf congratulates him on his profound contribution, so they must have had whatever celebration they were going to honor him with. I assume it was over at this point. Shmuel was it Shmuel or is it Shmuel? See, I'm trying to remember now because now I'm trying to be more conscientious of the pronunciation.
Well, the really interesting thing is I've heard Nicodemus say Shmuel, and I've heard him say Shmuel. And so I think that every time somebody pronounces it, it's different. So I think however you want to pronounce it is probably okay.
Yeah. I think I might even leave this in here too, because I think it's a good point. It does seem different. So I'll say Shmuel. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, Shmuel tells Nicodemus that the ceremony was glorious, and he calls him teacher. And he tells Nicodemus that his acts and discernment have been recorded for history. Nicodemus thanks him, and he also recognizes Shmuel's service. So Nicodemus says that he will be an important leader in their order for many years to come. Shmuel says that maybe it won't even be just Capernaum, that maybe someday he'll be in Jerusalem. And I think Nicodemus says something like perhaps, I guess I didn't write down exactly what he said. And Shmuel seems to think that Nicodemus's response is that he's not sold on the idea. And when he says something about it, kind of calling Nicodemus out, Nicodemus says that he thinks it's bold to assume outcomes. So Nicodemus says that their work is for God and that he chooses where it will take them. Shmuel goes on to tell Nicodemus that he's found a topic that he's very passionate about, even as much as others in Jerusalem, and it's false prophecy. Soon as Nicodemus hears this, his face goes very serious. He went from smiling and to what? And then Shmuel goes on to tell Nicodemus that the man from Nazareth was forgiving people's sins, and only God can do that. And that's when he turned to Shmuel. He repeated Shmuel's thoughts to him. So Shmuel was acknowledging that to Nicodemus. But then he goes on to say that he couldn't have used divination. And Nicodemus calls out that, hey, he came from Nazareth, not heaven. And he was simply just a man. So again, I feel like Nicodemus is trying to downplay what's happening. And he tells Nicodemus that the man claimed to be God and you said nothing. He says he's going to petition Jerusalem about everything in the archives related to this false prophecy. And he wants to know if Nicodemus is going to oppose his petition. And he says that everyone who reads his petition will wonder, what did Nicodemus do? Nicodemus says, so it's all about politics and promotion for you, not to serve God. Shmuel says that it's about the law, and the law is God. He insinuates that he learned it all from the very wisest, hinting at Nicodemus, and Nicodemus says that he won't oppose it. Then he tells Shmuel that he has learned nothing from him, and then he leaves, which I thought was kind of blunt too, like, ooh, they're not seeing eye to eye.
And I felt like Nicodemus had a very serious and to the point when he made it very clear, you have learned nothing from me. I remember thinking, wow, that's a lot coming from him because everybody thinks Nicodemus is so great and he's this wonderful teacher, which he is. And everybody's learning a lot from him. But for the teacher to actually tell him, you've learned nothing from me. And so little words, it spoke 1,000 words, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like Shmuel was a character that was created to show the rigid thinking of the law is God and that's the law, and to really show the growing tension, over the thought of Jesus. Yeah, I did double check that he wasn't a character in the Bible because I felt like I did remember you mentioning in a previous episode that he was created for the show. And I could only imagine being back there back then. And I can only imagine how much tension a Messiah, showing up is bringing, especially to people who are very rigid about their beliefs. And Shmuel has mentioned in previous episodes that he liked the predictability of Nicodemus's teachings, and it bothers him now that Nicodemus is seeing that, well, maybe it's not supposed to be so rigid, and maybe God can change and do different things, and he's accepting that, and he wants to accept it, and he is accepting it, but he's got to be careful too. I think he's afraid of, I don't know, maybe making himself into an outcast possibly, or I don't know.
Yeah, because he's got a position. So he's kind of got a position to uphold, and he's got the potential to lose that position if he makes enough people mad. I think that's a really good point, that's a good contrast to show that Nicodemus probably did have this where he was, because he met with Jesus, he didn't tell people about it, he didn't get Jesus in any kind of trouble, and he's contemplating these ideas that Jesus told him about, but then you have those people that are like, they're not even willing to hear it. They just think that it's blasphemous. Okay, so the next scene, we see Eden tending to her Ema, who is coughing and weak. Ema asks where Simon is, and Eden leaves the room and she's crying. The next thing you know, Jesus shows up and he's standing in the room, and she stops crying and she's trying to serve him. He tells her that she was the first one to see what he sees in Simon. Simon and Andrew walk in and say, we're going to head to town. Simon wants to get some extra money for Eden and her mom before they leave. Jesus says, stay a little bit longer, put down your nets, go sit with the mother-in-law. Andrew, I noticed, immediately does it. Like, soon as Jesus finishes, he starts putting his stuff down. Simon kind of stands there a little longer before doing what Jesus says, but he eventually does do it. So then he leaves the room, and then it's just Jesus and Eden, and he tells Eden that he told Simon to make sacrifices to follow him. He acknowledges that Eden and Simon are of one flesh, that they're married, and that Simon's sacrifices are also hers. He says that he can't make everything easier for her. She makes a comment like, that wouldn't be our people's way, which we've heard a couple times already. And then Jesus tells her that he sees her and that it isn't easy for her to be home while Simon is gone. He says that he wouldn't ask her to do this without taking care of a few things. Then Dasha, which I guess is her Ema's name, coughs, and he kind of nods in that direction of the cough. And she's like, you mean? And then she goes speechless. And Jesus says, normal Simon is difficult. Could you imagine traveling with a worried Simon? And then he rolls his eyes, and then Eden laughs. So he walks past her and he goes to Dasha, and he enters the room, and Simon says something about the temperature being high and that they should call a doctor. Jesus says there's no need. He sits down next to the bed. He puts his hand on Ema's hand and looks up. He closes his eyes, and when he opens his eyes, he says, leave her. Then you see Dasha gasp and sit up. And she looks around and then at Jesus, and she's like, who are you? And Andrew says, this is Jesus of Nazareth. She welcomes Jesus and then asks what she's doing lying here. And Andrew tells her that she's had a horrible fever. And she says, and all of you staring down. So it's almost like she realizes that they were staring down on her as if she was dead or dying. So Dasha jumps out of her bed saying, don't anyone move, and she'll be back with drinks. So then they all laugh. And then Eden and Simon hug and they stare at Jesus. And you hear her talking in the background, like what to make for Simon, and then asks if their friend likes goat cheese. And Jesus responds, yes. Simon and Eden laugh, and as Jesus says he needs to go see about the goat cheese, he leaves. And then Eden thanks Simon for obeying and following Jesus, and that it led Jesus to them. The Ema continues to call out questions about food preferences, and then Simon and Eden laugh.
I wanted to say a couple things. First of all, again, I love the comedy that they throw in with the goat cheese and all that. I just think it's kind of neat that they decide to do that. Also, and nobody else will probably know what I'm talking about when they hear this, but when Jesus sat down next to Dasha, there was a quick glimpse of him by the window. The way the sun was coming through in the background reminded me of that picture again that Bucha had hanging up in her house. And I thought, wow, this is just really cool to see that again.
I'm sure they used imagery with some of their cinematic to portray those moments. Jennifer, you look like you're about to burst to say something.
Well, I was just really excited that her emo was cured because this whole time I had been wondering, are they going to ask him? Are they going to ask him? And so I was just really excited that she was healed and that she jumped up and immediately started serving him. And I also enjoy the comedy part too, imagining Jesus rolling his eyes at somebody at a story he's saying, or somebody being like Simon. But also Simon, he's got a lot of hesitancy. It is interesting to see the difference between him and Andrew. Andrew just instantly, whatever is said, he's just right on board. Where Simon's like, I got to think about this for a second. There's definitely a difference between the two of them. They are brothers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me wonder truly like what he was like back in that time, because you hear, with that whole story of when Simon was called and they talk about how he was gambling or drinking and doing these different things and fishing on Shabbat. And you hear some biblical historians say, well, no, he was an avid follower. He was seeking Jesus already. So it makes me wonder if he really would have hesitated all these times, but I still like the storyline, and I like seeing the difference with Andrew and him too. How Andrew will just drop and follow, and that he's a little more on the reluctant side. Yeah. I did want to point out that Luke 4:38 through 39, it's just 2 verses. It's pretty short. Talks about the mother-in-law getting healed. And it's the only time that's how we know Simon is married. We don't hear Eden's name. We don't hear Dasha as a name. It says, Jesus left the synagogue and went to the house of Simon. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked Jesus to help her. So he bent over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. She got up at once and began to wait on them. So that is actually in the Bible, but it's a real short thing. But I thought it was interesting that they portrayed her jumping out of bed right away. Let me get you some drinks. And maybe not talking about goat cheese, but they added that as like a humorous part of serving everybody.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to kind of like what Jennifer said earlier, because Jessica knows that I think a couple episodes ago when we did a recording that I kept thinking or asking Jessica, oh, I wonder what's going to happen in the next episodes if they're going to ask Jesus to heal her. And they really don't in the story. Now you're saying in the Bible that they did ask for him to heal her, right? Isn't that what you just said? That you read a story?
Yeah, it did say that.
Which is interesting because now in this series, they don't. And we talked about that last time. Like, maybe they don't want to
burden him,
with because he's got a much bigger plan. But I liked that. I was like, whew, okay, he finally went over there and healed Ema. I liked that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too, because in the last episode, they even have a point where she's coughing in the background and Simon's telling Eden, get her to be quiet, because he doesn't want to burden Jesus with it. So that was like something too, which obviously wasn't in the Bible, because it does say that actually, it says they asked Jesus to help her, but they don't say who they is. I did also want to point out that there was a note in my Bible that said that the study Bible, that this miracle was in all three synoptics, uh, but only in Luke, which I guess Luke was a doctor, had the specific phrase high fever. So the story was in there. And I looked up what synoptic gospel means, and it said that like the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and synoptic is from the Greek word synoptikos, meaning seeing together or viewed side by side. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke were stories where they all three witnessed these different things and wrote about some of them. So the next scene is in a city center. You see the woman from the well walking through. She picks up an orange and she smells it. The vendor doesn't even look at her. He says, "We don't serve your kind here." She serves herself and pays, calling him out on the fact that he wouldn't even look at her. So it was a real quick little snippet, which they get into a little bit later.
I was actually kind of hoping that you were going to talk about this scene, even though it was very short. There's a couple things that I wanted to say. One, I felt bad for her because I felt the way I did when people would treat Matthew poorly in public because he was a tax collector, that just because she has sinned or she's living with another man, which I get that rules and laws were apparently way different back in the day, but it makes you feel bad for her character. And I don't know if anybody picked this up. And I went back twice and looked, and I think I seen what I saw when she put her money down and said, "I could serve myself." When she walked away, the camera was on the gentleman that would not look at her, and he looked over at her money, and it looked like he spit on it.
I didn't see that.
I didn't either.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Like he didn't even want to pick it up. It was not
Like it was
worthy enough
defiled.
for him, whatever. Yeah. And I thought, did I just see that? And I played it back and it looked like that again. He even did like a head thing where where it looked like he was like spitting on her money. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I'll have to rewatch it.
Yeah,
'cause
I
I'm
watched it.
curious.
I watched it twice and I didn't catch that. But I was thinking that it must be the combination of the fact that they don't serve her kind, as he worded it. It must be a combination of the fact that she's had several husbands and now is currently living with a man that's not her husband. So I'm thinking that that's got to be like the ultimate sin there.
Oh, I can imagine.
Maybe just even being divorced marks her as that kind. Because we don't think much of that now, but guess that was probably a pretty big deal back then.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty commonplace nowadays, I feel like. You hear of a lot of people that are. So the next scene is in Quintus's office, and he's ordering someone to take down a decree in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, and he says so that no one can claim ignorance. By order of Rome, so this is what it's going to say, by order of Rome and punishable by detention and imprisonment, religious gatherings outside of synagogue and Hebrew school are strictly prohibited. And then he says the teacher known as Jesus of Nazareth is sought for questioning. So I don't know if that's on the same thing or if he's just saying that part. The document they show is in another language, so I have no idea if that last sentence about the teacher known as Jesus of Nazareth is sought for questioning was part of that decree or not.
I was assuming that it was. And I also thought I felt nervous watching him pin that up, knowing how it's all going to end in the long run. I just was like, oh no, it's beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely you can feel it building. So the next scene is Matthew leaving his house. He's closing the large door to his courtyard. And I noticed, I don't know if you guys caught on the last couple times that we saw this, Matthew used to lock it 3 times. He only does it once this time, and he doesn't sit there and incessantly lock it. And I thought that was very interesting.
I noticed that too.
Yeah, it's almost like you said, Janice, kind of like with Simon, now that he's following Jesus, those other things aren't as important. He knows what's more important now. And I almost feel like it's the same with Matthew. Matthew's no longer worried about his possessions and making sure everything's all locked up. He just is getting on with his next mission.
Yeah.
So then you see Andrew, James, John, and Mary all leaving their homes and families and heading out. And then you see Nicodemus's wife, Sahara. She's preparing for their departure. She has servants helping her put things away, and then Nicodemus is carrying some kind of little box, and he walks out of the room. Then you see Simon hug Dasha and Eden as he's leaving. So that whole scene was like everybody leaving, getting ready to go somewhere. So then you see everyone meeting at a place which looks like a fountain. Jesus places his bag next to the fountain. Slowly, everyone meets up there. And then you see Nicodemus peeking around a corner at them. One of the disciples says, "That should be everyone." And Jesus asks, "Everyone is here?" And he's looking around, and his voice is aimed to where Nicodemus is kind of hiding. And one of the apostles says, "Yes, this is all of us." Nicodemus kind of peeks around, and Jesus asks, "Is there anyone else?" And as he does, you see Nicodemus turn away, and he's crying. Simon spots a bag and picks it up. He opens it and finds out that it's full of gold. Jesus says, "A friend of mine left that for us." Matthew quickly looks at what Simon's holding, and he estimates its value at enough for 2 weeks of food and lodging. Jesus looks disappointed. The camera pans over to Nicodemus, and he's crying. Jesus whispers, "You came so close." And then Mary, who's standing next to him, is like, "What do you mean?" And he doesn't respond to her. And then Simon says that they need to leave if they're going to make it to camp before night. So they all start leaving. You see Nicodemus now sobbing. The apostles and Mary all head out. Simon asks Matthew if that's what he's going to wear on the trip, is kind of like a humor thing, I thought. And then you see Nicodemus really sobbing and like leaning against the wall. I actually thought that he was going to slide all the way down the wall because I felt like he was lowering too, but they don't show that. But you just feel like this sinking feeling looking at him sobbing. It was very heart-wrenching.
Yes, he portrayed his heart breaking over his decision so well. Like, I felt horrible for him and how he was feeling in that moment. He did such a good job portraying that he really believes he's making the wrong decision by not following. But I think you brought up a good point earlier about he's got position, and maybe also part of him feels like his position might help Jesus in the future. Maybe he realizes that this is going to go poorly. Maybe he's going to try to use his position to help him.
That's a good point. He has already a couple times when people were talking about John the Baptist or different things that happened. He was trying to play it down because he was very interested, but you could tell he's reluctant to let them get too far with what they're trying to do, like all these investigations and things. They're trying to make it more formal.
Yes, I agree with that. And the comment that Simon made about Matthew's clothing was interesting because you can tell that Matthew is the fanciest of the group. Jesus in his one-piece cloth, and Matthew in pretty much probably the fanciest outfit he has, but he decided that that was going to be the thing he was going to travel in.
Yeah, I also kind of wondered briefly, is it a tax collector's outfit? But I don't think there was such a thing. I kind of wondered that, but it was very fancy. It almost looked like it was embroidered. It maybe had a little bit of a shimmer. It's like that thing's going to get dirty.
Well, I wasn't gonna because you guys just explained that all just so perfectly right out of my mouth. But going back to Nicodemus, yeah, you could definitely see the heartbreak. He wanted to follow him so bad, but I think was thinking of his wife too and her wanting to go back home. Yeah, he had a really hard time with that. I felt it when I watched it. Wow, you can really see the pain and the heartbreak that he's going through. And I did want to mention something that Jennifer, you didn't mention, that I think Jesus knew that Nicodemus was there, but didn't join them for whatever reason. I think he sensed it or he knew that he was there just by the way he was talking.
With that, yeah, because he was projecting his voice out like he was trying to call Nicodemus out of the shadow to join them. Yeah.
Yeah, and it even kind of reminded me, kind of like Jesus being denied twice, because he calls out the first, "Is everyone here?" And then he calls out again. I feel like he gave him a couple chances to come out of the hiding spot and join them, and he didn't. I guess I was just thinking, if it was me, and I think he is in a difficult spot, like especially if he's comfortable, and knowing following Jesus is going to completely uproot your life, have to get rid of everything. I don't know what I would have done. I would have hoped I would have followed, but I think it would have been a difficult spot to be in.
I was going to say that I feel similar to Jessica in the sense of like, would I follow? Would I give up everything? Because Everybody who knows me knows that the one luxury that I love is my internet. But I also feel like it's easy to question it when you're so many thousands of years removed. I would like to believe that if I was standing there and watched a crippled man walk and a leper be cured and the mother-in-law's fever go away, that I would instantly be like, absolutely, I'm on board. Get rid of all this junk here. So agree with
Yeah,
that.
and I think about it too, not just internet. Yeah, that's nice, and air conditioning and stuff like that. But I think about I'm a creature of habit. It would completely uproot everything I do as just my normal day to day. And yeah, so I don't know. It just definitely gets you thinking for sure. Okay, so the next scene you see Gaius knocking on a door. When the door opens, you see Matthew's mother, and his father's in the background and drops something when his wife tells him that a Roman is at the door. The next part of that scene, you see Gaius inside, and Matthew's father's asking, "What did it mean, follow me?" Gaius responds that that's all he said, and Matthew did not hesitate. Gaius tells them that Matthew believes the man is a prophet. His mother says, "The man that healed the paralytic at Zebedee's house." Gaius says to be careful with that word healed. They don't know what kind of tricks or illusions were involved. His father says that Matthew has no interest in illusions or your God. The parents recognize that Matthew upended his wicked life to follow Jesus. They know he doesn't make brash decisions. Gaius says that Matthew wanted him to deliver his personal effects. He hands the key to Matthew's house over to the father. Immediately, his father's like, "I will not accept it. It was bought," and I quoted this from the movie line. It says, "Since it was luxury bought off the backs of our people." So Gaius says, "Then sell it, give it away, or burn it." And then he says, "Don't burn it." And he hands the key to the father. And the other thing, the other thing that Matthew was going to give them was outside. And when they went outside, it turns out that it's Matthew's dog. The parents don't understand. And then Gaius explains that people with bad intentions hate the dog, and that the father travels a lot and he leaves the wife alone. So the dog would be a good source of protection. Gaius tells Matthew's parents that if he returns to them, they should notify Gaius. Matthew isn't wanted, but that Jesus is being sought after for questioning. He says it would be in all of their best interest if they contacted Gaius first. He says he knows some people that are mildly fond of their son. The parents kind of laugh after Gaius leaves, and then the dog whines, and they look at it with like a look of trouble on their face. I think that comment is him, that he's mildly fond of their son and he wants to look out for him. So I think that they'll know that if he does show up, that they're probably okay letting Gaius know that he's there.
I really liked that part because you could tell that it was Gaius that was fond of Matthew, but he didn't want to like come out and say that it was just himself. So he said, "I know people that were very fond of your son." I liked that. It really showed, which is really interesting because I remember talking to Jessica about this on other episodes when Matthew would go to Quintus and Gaius is his escort, that I always felt like Gaius always thought that Matthew wasn't thinking this through. You don't understand what Quintus could do to us, but Matthew didn't care. He would still go and talk to him. I felt like this was kind of a shocker. Like, wow, this whole time Gaius liked him, but just never showed it.
Yeah, I agree. This definitely made me feel like Gaius looked at him as a friend, mildly fond of. I liked that line. It was pretty interesting. And I liked when the parents looked at each other and said, "How does it work in terms of the dog?" Like they just didn't understand the concept, which I guess I could kind of understand that, a domesticated animal not really being something that was a usual thing then. So I did have to laugh about that. I made a note that I thought it was very funny.
I never really thought about that, and I didn't even look up if that was a typical thing then. They probably didn't have them domesticated as pets then. Okay, so the next scene is Jesus and the apostles, and they're walking through trees in a field. Matthew's looking at a map. They're all discussing directions to Jezreel, and Jesus tells them they aren't going there, that they're going to Samaria. And they all look stunned and ask if it's a joke. Andrew says it's safer to go around Samaria, and James and John say that these are all the people that profaned our temple with the dead bones. They fought against us with the Seleucids in the Maccabean War. And then John says he's never even spoken to a Samaritan before. So Jesus responds with, "And we destroyed their temple 100 years ago." He tells them that none of them were here when those things happened. And he goes on to say that if they're going to keep questioning him on everything they do, it's going to be a very annoying time for all of them, which I thought was kind of funny. And then Jesus says, if we get attacked, Simon will show us what to do. Simon smiles huge and says, absolutely. That's where that scene ended.
I got a kick out of that. I thought that was funny because Simon really doesn't strike me as somebody that would have been considered a fighter. He does act very protective throughout the series of the group and of Jesus, especially Jesus, but there was really nothing. I guess maybe that very first scene where he's fighting the two brothers, you get the feeling that there's some kind of a scam maybe going on or a bet or something. I forgot about that part. And it just hit me now. Because this whole time I'm like, why do they keep acting like he's like this big fighter? But I guess in a way he is kind of like their the entertainment there when it came to the fighting and stuff. So, okay, so I stand corrected on that. I just remembered.
Yeah, I forgot about that scene too. But he is always making these comments about people needing protection or someone needs to watch out for Jesus's back and things like that. But we haven't seen him other than that first time get into fights with people. So the next scene you see Mary leaving from a residence and the apostles leaving from another. And I guess they purposely wanted to portray that when they're traveling, that since Mary was the only woman and it wouldn't have been typical at that time for that to happen, that they were staying in separate places at night. They didn't think it was appropriate to show her camping out as just one woman with all these men at a campsite. So they purposely showed her coming out of a place like a residence where she rented from and then them coming from another one. And then you see them all heading out, and ahead of them you see a well. The apostles are saying that they're almost out of food and they need to stop. And Jesus says, very well. And Matthew says there's a town about a mile away. So Jesus tells them to go and he'll wait here. Simon says that someone should stay with him just in case. Again, he's trying to be the protector. And Jesus says he'll be all right and for them to meet him at the well when they get back. So Jesus goes to the well and he sits down, and you can tell that it's hot. A woman approaches carrying the 2 clay vessels on a shoulder yoke, and it's Photina again. And when she sets everything down, Jesus asks her, "Give me a drink?" And she doesn't respond. And when he asks her if she can hear him, she says, is it that bad that he asks her for a drink? And she alludes to the fact that he's a Jew and she's a Samaritan and she's a woman. And he says, sorry, I should have said please. She tells him he isn't safe out there alone, and he tells her the same thing. And then when he asks her why she hasn't come with the others and why so late in the day, she tells him how none of the others will be seen with her and thanks for reminding her of that. When he asks why, she just says it's a long story. And then he tells her he'd still like a drink of water. She asks him, isn't she unclean to him? Wouldn't he be defiled by her vessel? And he tells her some say that, but he doesn't. And when she asks what he would say, he responds with, I say, if you knew who I am, you'd be asking me for a drink, and I would give you living water. She points out that he has nothing to draw water with, and it's a deep well. She says, what would he need from her if he has his own supply of living water? She asks if Jewish water is better than Samaritan water. She also asks if he's a better man than their ancestor Jacob, who dug the well. Your water is better than his? And Jesus tells her that he knows Jacob, and that everyone who drinks of this well, of the one that Jacob dug, will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water that he gives will never be thirsty again. And she said that that would be nice. He continues that the water I give will become in a person a spring of water, welling up to eternal life. She tells him to prove it, and he tells her to go get her husband, and he will show them both. She says she doesn't have a husband. He says that she's right, she has had 5 husbands, and she stops what she's doing and she looks at him, and he tells her that the man she's living with now isn't her husband. She laughs and says, you're a prophet, to preach at me. And she says one of the good things about going to the well, when she does, is to escape being condemned. And he tells her that he isn't there to condemn her. She goes on to say how Jews say the only place they can worship is the temple, but they aren't allowed in the temple. And he tells her that he is there to break the barriers. She asks where she's supposed to go when she needs God. Before he can answer, she goes on to say that she hasn't received anything from God, but that she couldn't thank him anyway, even if she wanted to. So Jesus tells her that God is spirit and it won't matter where she worships, only that she do it in spirit and truth, heart and mind. She looks deep in thought, and he says it won't matter where you're from or what you've done. She stands there for a while, and then she turns away, nodding side to side as if she's saying no. And then Jesus asks her if she believes what he's telling her, and she says that when the Messiah comes, he will explain everything and sort out the mess, including her. She doesn't trust anyone. He says she is wrong when she says she's never received anything from God. He says, "This Messiah you speak of, I am he." He says, "The first one was Ramin. You were a woman of purity who was excited to be married." Then she stops what she's doing. He continues to tell her about each husband. She tells him to stop. At some point, she drops the clay vessels that she was carrying that had the water in them. And he knows the details of how she likes the scent of oranges because of one of her husbands that smelled like oranges on their wedding night. He knew that she felt guilty leaving him because he was the only truly godly man she had been with. So at this point, she's crying and asking him why he's doing this. And he tells her that he hasn't revealed himself in public as the Messiah. She is the first, and it would be good if she believed him. She tells him he picked the wrong person, and he tells her that he came to Samaria to meet her. She cries, and he asks her if she thinks it's an accident that he's there in the middle of the day. She tells him that she's rejected by the others, and he tells her that he knows, but that she's not rejected by the Messiah. So she finally looks him in the eyes, and then she gasps. And then she says, "And you know these things because you are the Christ." And he nods. And laughing, she says, "I'm going to tell everyone." He smiles that he was counting on it, and she laughs and says, "Spirit and truth?" And she says, "It won't be about mountains or temples." And he says, "Soon, just the heart." And then she asks, "You promise?" And he says, "I promise." So then you see the disciples and Mary arrive, and she tells them, "This man told me everything I've done. Oh, he must be the Christ." And she runs toward town. Andrew's yelling for her to wait when he sees her clay vessels on the ground. And as she's running toward town, she is yelling, "Come see a man who told me everything I did." So that is all from John 4, 1 through 42. It's not word for word.
At the beginning of their conversation, and of course, obviously, unbeknownst to her, that he was Jesus, I remember feeling kind of shocked that he asked for water a couple of times. She did not give it to him. And I kept thinking, doesn't she know who he is? But she didn't until the end of the conversation. And I don't know why I wanted to point that out. I guess I just thought that it's just funny because it's like when you look at Andrew, anytime Jesus says something, Andrew drops what he's doing to do it, abide by him, whatever. So it was funny to see that this woman did not. She didn't really care to hear anything he had to say until the very end.
Yeah, the whole exchange between Photina and Jesus is very heated on her end. He's very calm and almost apologetic for even speaking to her in a way. And she's just really laying into him, I felt like. And then when she actually finally decides to look at his face and look him in the eye, she's convinced by whatever it is that needed to convince her that he is of the Christ, as she calls him. And she practically dances down that path. I mean, it was such a turnaround. And I was really curious if the beginning of next season was going to pick up there. And I was really curious, and I wanted to go ahead, but I spent some extra time because I watched this episode twice, that I didn't get an opportunity to watch the first episode of the next season. I was really curious how the others were going to perceive her when she runs into town yelling this, and if anybody's going to believe her, because she is sort of, I guess, what we would call nowadays a black sheep.
Or an outcast, yeah.
An outcast, yeah.
I wondered that too. Not only do they not like her kind, whatever that is, but is she going to look even more nuts to them after this?
Yeah. And I don't remember, it's been a while since I watched the episode, so I don't remember if they show what happens after that with her, but I do have a bunch of notes about that story. So in this, I did want to point out that Jesus is weary. So you see like his human side, and he's actually sitting at the well and he's waiting. So he's waiting for her. There's other ways that he could have gone to the next city, but he had to meet her. And so she was a wounded woman, and he calls her out that she's had 5 husbands. Back in those days, a woman couldn't divorce her husband, and they talk about that a little bit in there. Only a man could divorce the woman, and he could divorce her for any reason. And so technically, if you think about it, because you think, oh, I guess you could portray it like, oh, she's had 5 husbands, and they see it as like maybe this sinful thing, but she couldn't divorce them. They had to divorce her. So if you think about it that way too, technically she was abandoned and discarded by her husbands. The only one now is the one that won't divorce her because he says she's his, but he's treating her like a possession. So she tries to change the topic when Jesus is talking about this stuff and switches it to places of worship, and he tries to bring it back. So it's interesting because she's talking about the well, the water in that well. He's talking about the living water, which is the Holy Spirit. She's talking about places of worship, and he's talking about her being right there in front of him, that he's there. The well that they have there won't sustain versus his well, the living water that will sustain. So he's trying to tell her of a new way, no longer the need for a priest. Because if we remember talking about those episodes where women were allowed into the temple only to a certain point, then the rest of the people, the men, were to a certain point, and then there was a certain point where only the priest was allowed into this veiled area, and it was only certain times of the year. So he's saying no longer will this priest need to be a head in this veil of the temple. They'll be able to access God through Jesus. It won't need to be at the temple.
When he asked for the water and she said, "Don't you consider me to be unclean? Wouldn't you be," I forgot the word she used.
Defiled or something?
Yes, thank you. When you drink out of the vessel. I was wondering, do you think she was meaning that because she was Samaritan, or and there was this like rivalry between their nationalities, or was it because she had 5 husbands and it was her specifically?
I think it's both. I actually think it's multiple things from what I'm reading. So definitely there was a huge rift between the Jews and the Samaritans. There was a lot of old standing just hatred between each other. So there was that, plus the fact that even her own people and the women in her own town, they've all separated themselves from her because of her lifestyle, or because she has, been divorced 5 times and now she's living with somebody that she's not married to. So I think it's multifaceted. And the other thing that they explained, I think they talked a little bit about it in the round table, is that a Jewish rabbi, I guess, would never go to a woman one-on-one in public, or just be, I don't know exactly to what extent, because I was like, well, wait a minute. Nicodemus talked to Mary, and that wasn't a big deal, right? And I mean, yeah, they were out in the open, but they're technically out in the open at the well, but they're by themselves. So maybe that's the part too. So there was kind of numerous things, but in the Bible verse under John 4, verse 9, it does say for that part, it says, the Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." So in that case, the way it's worded here, it does seem like it would be because not only she's a Samaritan, but she's also a woman. But it's mostly for the Jews not associating with Samaritans and vice versa.
I did read that and I forgot. So that was actually a very good reminder, because I did look up that Bible verse and I did read John. I actually read John 1 through 6 just because I got caught up in it.
I did also have a note that was interesting, a couple points. So her transition through this scene. So initially she recognizes him as a man that's thirsty, then as a Jew, and then she starts to act like she dislikes him. And then she recognizes him as a rabbi, and she kind of heckles him with these questions. And then she recognizes he's a prophet, and who's kind of like sweeping her off of her feet with the stuff he's saying. And then she's realizes he's the Messiah. And at that point, she's just absolutely in adoration and just celebrating when she realizes it. So it's kind of interesting that got pointed out in another thing I was reading, and I was like, oh, I like that. Because, yeah, you see that transition as they're talking, the way she changes her attitude toward him as they're discussing it more and more. And then I also wanted to mention the contrast. So in chapter 3 of John is the story with Nicodemus. And Nicodemus, he's a teacher of Israel. He's a Jewish man. He's a Pharisee. He teaches the Bible. He's technically representing everything that's right. And then you got chapter 4, the Samaritan woman. She's a Samaritan. She's a woman. She's leading an immoral life. She's discarded by society. She's considered living in rebellion. But even then, when Jesus meets with Nicodemus, he's telling him that like his religious duties don't mean anything, that he's saved by grace through faith alone. And the same message gets told to the Samaritan woman. So whether you're a person that's like Nicodemus or a person that's like the Samaritan woman, he's saying you can't save yourself and heal yourself. Only the grace of God through Jesus can do that. So I thought that was kind of interesting, the contrast. And I never thought like, oh yeah, the stories are right next to each other in the Bible. I feel like it was very impactful, and I could see why people really like the story.
I wanted to mention a couple things. And you may have said something about it, but we've talked about other stuff, so I don't remember. So that was the last scene at the well after Jesus pretty much told her who he is, and she runs down kind of childlike, skipping and excited. I really love the conversation like that Simon had with him. He was like confirming she knows, and it's okay that she tells people. And did you guys recognize how Simon like embraces Jesus like he's a buddy, like they're buddies? I kind of thought that was cool, the way Simon like kind of embraced him. But I don't know if you guys noticed this, but Jesus left his leather bag at the well. And so I thought, okay, that means something maybe that we might see in the next episode. He left
Maybe.
it there for a reason.
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe there's something in the bag that is going to help somebody later. But I noticed that as episode ended, he's walking away without his bag.
I just had a couple lines that I wrote down from after that. I guess I felt like I kind of rushed through the scene, but I was trying to summarize the scene with the Samaritan woman. But the scene after that is they're still at the well, but little James is like, Rabbi, we have food. What would you like? And he tells him that I have food to eat that you don't know about. And Simon's like, wait a minute, you told her? And Jesus nods. And then Simon says, and she can tell others? And one of the other apostles says, who brought you food? What food? It's funny because there's different conversations going on. And then Jesus says that his food is to do the will of him who sent him to accomplish his work.
I do have to say that I find it funny that Andrew always seems to be eating. So when he asked who gave him food, he had a piece of bread and he had already taken a bite out of it when he said it. It was just kind of funny to me, like just
funny.
a little side funny note with Andrew, like being all about the food and stuff. And so they're just kind of interesting.
And Simon is still stuck on that Jesus told her who he is. And Jesus says that they're going to stay there for a few days and says it's been a long time sowing and now the fields are ripe for harvest. And so Simon says, so it's time? And Jesus kind of smiles, or I don't remember if he smiles or what, but he looks at him and he's like, let's go. And Simon's like, yes. And then the apostles all laugh. And then I loved that they played that song, Trouble, as they're all walking towards Samaria. So yeah, that was kind of it was good.
I didn't realize the song. I thought the song was cool, but now that you said that, yeah.
Yeah, I was so caught up in Photina dancing down the pathway back to town and Simon being so excited about the Messiah finally revealing himself publicly that I did not notice that Jesus left his bag by the well. But watching them all walk basically almost in slow motion to that Trouble song was like, oh yeah, you could say that. Trouble for sure.
Was it trouble for them or trouble for everybody else? Right.
Right.
Yeah, and the only reason we know it's called Trouble, again, is the captioning, Janice. They tell you the title of it, but as you listen to the songs, if you do listen to the words, then you hear them say the words trouble in the song too.
Yeah.
But it says trouble playing or something like that in the caption. So that's how we knew it was called that.
Okay.
Yeah, I might rewind just the end of it and just check that out where he left his bag, because that is an interesting point. And that is something that I probably normally would have noticed and went, what's happening here? But it just didn't. Like I said, I feel like every episode there's so much to unpack in every episode that I've seen, and there's only 8. And I get it, their series now they're not very long. They're not 24 episodes like they used to be. When we were growing up, a show was 24 episodes for the season. I mean, and now they're short and sweet, and they're trying to pack a lot in, and I get that. So there's a lot to unpack in every episode that I've seen, and I could have tons of things to say about each one.
I know that's why it's like I tried to make the episodes shorter, and it's like, well, when they go along, maybe I'll cut them in half and I'll just put part 1 and part 2. Because there's a lot like trying to cover it all, and it's like, oh boy, because there's a lot in here. I did want to say that when they talk about Photina, that's just a name. It says that that's the name traditionally given to the woman at the well, but we don't really know if that's historically accurate. But that's why she was called that in this episode. And then I wanted to read this excerpt. I got this book that's Get Used to Different. It's a student guide from the Chosen series, but I thought it was sometimes there's some good little snippets in here. It says, in The Chosen, we understand these details through Photiна's eyes. That's the name of the woman at the well in the show. We're able to see her not just as another Bible character, but we learn about, but as a real person, someone who lived a life full of heartbreak and loss. 5 husbands, a ton of rejection, and when Jesus entered the scene, living with a new guy who wasn't her husband. She was clearly looking for something, but no matter how many places she searched, no matter how many husbands she took, she was left wanting more, which was why Jesus said to her, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water that I give him will never be thirsty again. Once she found Jesus, she was done looking, and here's the point. God is who you're looking for, even when you're looking everywhere else. So I thought that was interesting and a nice little summary, I guess, of the scene.
I wondered when I heard that if that was like some type of metaphor, but obviously it didn't explain it when he said, those that drink from this well will always be thirsty, but if you drink water from me, you wouldn't be. And I figured it was a metaphor, and you just explained it good. So that makes sense to me now.
But yeah, it is supposed to be a metaphor for spiritual thirst or yearning, or when we're searching for something. Like, for instance, when I said I felt like I was getting this calling, like something telling me there's something I'm supposed to be doing, and that goes away, I feel like, when we find what we're looking for.
I was thinking that I kind of knew what he was saying when he meant living water, and I kind of translated it to mean the Holy Spirit. And I feel like somewhere in my distant memory, I've heard that be, living water and Holy Spirit kind of interchangeable. And probably just from past memories of the preachings of our grandmother that probably mentioned it, or I saw it or read it somewhere else over the years, but kind of understood that that's what he meant.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there where I feel like it can be confusing. It's like there's times I get it and there's times that it's confusing. It does say that Jesus went to the well intentionally. He knew who he was going to find there. He was, in fact, looking for her, the outcast of outcasts. And once she met Jesus, she was done looking in all the wrong places because she had found what her soul was searching for. So that was just from there. I wanted to finish reading that. Again, this is one of those stories when I feel like when you read it from the Bible, and it's got like 42 verses in the Bible, I believe. Yeah. John 4, 1 through 42. They say it's one of the longest conversations he had with somebody in the Bible that's documented in there. But I feel like it's different when you see them acting it out, and the way that the actress did and everything, I felt like it was very powerful. So I definitely think that reading it versus seeing it being acted out. And they do. I mean, he pretty much goes there. She's drawing water. He asks her for the drink. She says, you're a Jew. I'm a Samaritan woman. And then he says to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. And she makes the comment about not having anything to draw the water with, that the well is deep, and where are you going to get this living water? And even the questioning of, are you greater than Jacob and his sons and all this other stuff? And then he tells her, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And then she actually says, sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. And that's when he tells her, go call your husband and come back. And then she says, I have no husband. And he's like, you're right. You've had no husband. The fact is you've had 5. So a lot of this is in there, but that part's a little bit different. Like instead of her kind of saying, prove it, she says, give me this water so I won't get thirsty. And he says, go get your husband and come back. And then they get into that whole conversation. So there's a lot of that. And then she does bring up the whole thing about where they worship and all that. So a lot of the conversation, it's in the Bible. I just didn't want to necessarily read all 42 verses because I feel like I know this episode's already long. So people can look it up themselves if they want to read it. So it does say toward the end, the woman said, I know that the Messiah called Christ is coming. And when he comes, he will explain everything to us. And then Jesus declares, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. And then it talks about the disciples returning and joining them. And they were surprised to find him talking to the woman, but no one asks, what do you want or why are you talking to her? And then she leaves her water jar and then went back to town and said to the people, come and see the man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? They came out of the town and made their way toward him. Meanwhile, his disciples urged him to eat something, and he tells them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. And they're asking each other, could someone have brought him food? And then he says the food is that of the will of the one who sent him. So all that stuff was from there too. And then he talks about the harvest and how the fields are ripe for harvest, which is, I think they're saying that now is time to start being fishers of men and bringing all these people in. And then there's a comment in here too for verse 36. It says, even now the one who reaps draws a wage and harvests a crop for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may be glad together. Thus the saying, one sows and another reaps is true. I sent you to reap what you have not worked for. Others have done the hard work, and you have reaped the benefits of their labor. And I was wondering if he was saying that to the disciples. So that was kind of an interesting, I almost feel like he's saying someone else went ahead and did all the work, unless that was him, and now they're going to reap the benefits. I guess I'll have to, I know I probably should have looked it up to see what it meant, but and then this is the part that I guess that they don't go into, but it says, many Samaritans believe. So in verse 39, many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, we no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard it for ourselves. And we know that this man really is the savior of the world. So I thought that was interesting. So that's why it's such an important thing. Because of her, many people became believers because of her testimony.
Then it seems to me that it's interesting in the Bible. It's one of the longest conversations because it does sound like she is, even in the Bible, the first one he reveals himself to as well. And
Yeah.
so it seemed
Fitting.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to say apropos, but I wasn't sure if that was the right word.
I
So
don't even know what that means. Yeah, I feel like they always find little ways to throw humor in there that
like
make you
it.
laugh. And I was bawling when the woman, that whole exchange between Jesus and the woman, especially when she recognizes him, and then you could just see her whole face light up. And then as she's running away like the little schoolgirl, I'm like laughing because she's just so giddy. So it's like it was a really good episode. It's pretty powerful.
I felt like it was a very powerful episode from beginning to end, just with the additional tensions added, the heated conversations, the realizations, all of it was very, very powerful for me. I don't feel like I got particularly emotional. I feel like so far the only time I really got emotional was when Simon dropped to his knees when he was asked to follow. It did, especially Nicodemus's heartbreaking scene, it did pull up my heartstrings. So yeah, the whole episode was just really great. And
Yeah,
I
it
really
was
enjoyed it.
good.
I liked a lot of the different scenes. It's hard to really pick a favorite. I think they're all unique in their own way. But I did really like the one with Nicodemus deciding not to follow. That was really one of the ones that stood out to me on this one.
From beginning to end, there was just the scenes of tension, the scenes of heated conversations, realizations of the Messiah. Yeah, the whole thing was pretty good. And even though I might not have been emotional about it, there were still some like not in my stomach, gut-wrenching feelings, especially with Nicodemus.
Yes, I agree.
And then the apostles' reactions and stuff, and then them going back and forth about the food kind of made me laugh. But yeah, they're definitely interjecting a lot of stuff that's discussion worthy of the stuff that Jesus is saying, like him saying that my food is to do the will of that him that sent me. So there's just a lot to digest in these episodes.
Is that a food pun?
Yeah, there we go. There is. There's a lot. Did you guys have any other final thoughts about any of it?
No, I just want to say that I am glad that after listening, I think I listened to the first 3 podcasts that you did, and then I thought, I need to watch these to see what this is all about, because I had no intention on watching it. But I'm glad I did. I'm really enjoying it, and it is giving me a lot of food for thought, especially in my own spiritual journey. So a lot of food for thought, a lot of real contemplation. Yeah, I'm just really glad that I decided to watch it along with listening to the podcast.
Yeah.
I was saying that I as well, I didn't think that I would get into it, but like I told Jessica when we did the very first couple ones, I was drawn into it very quickly and thought, wow, I could really see me watching the whole thing.
Yeah, I guess it's because I kind of can relate. I think I related with Simon, and I think that's why his story, I think that's what got me, was Simon falling to his knees, like, accepting the invitation, so to speak. And it just, that was the one thing I think the reason why I got emotional during that scene was because it always reminds me of the line, is it Hark the Herald Angels Sing when you fall to your knee? It's one of the Christmas songs, and I think there's a line in there where it's like, fall to your knees.
Fall on your knees. Noel. I think it's Noel.
Okay, so that song, when it comes on or when it plays on a playlist, it always kind of gives me the feeling in my throat, like it always gets me. Yeah, I don't know what you would call that.
It's like
feeling,
fall on my knees, hear the angel voices.
Yeah.
And then I think it's Noel.
Okay. I thought about that song played in my head when I saw that, but that also is like the one thing that's what gets me, is the acceptance finally. And the falling to the knees is like you're giving into the acceptance of, yes, this is it.
Yeah, no, it's very impactful. And I think that's the thing that I love so much about the series is the way, and even if the people aren't exactly like it, because they're making these characters all so different and they are trying to follow the story as much as they can, but different people are going to relate to different characters. Like someone might relate to Matthew, someone might relate to Nicodemus. And I was trying to explain, I was actually talking to Jennifer Janice after we recorded episode 7. And so I'm still editing episode 7. Because I was having a hard time explaining why that story about Nicodemus impacted me so much. And I think I finally figured out what it was, and I need to like write it out. And I'm going to do a separate little snippet to explain it better, because I felt like I didn't really get it covered in the podcast episode. So I might have to do like an add-on, but I don't want to make the episode longer. But I do feel like these different stories are going to speak to people differently. Someone might be more impacted by Mary's story. And so I do like that. And I think we're all different. And that's the whole point. Different things are going to speak to us differently.
I completely agree with that, for sure.
Thank you guys so much for joining my sisters, and then everybody as well as the listeners. Hopefully you all enjoyed listening as well.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed having you on too, Jennifer. Janice usually joins me, so I'm glad you got to join us this time.
Yeah, I'm glad I was able to as well.
We'll see if you decide to come on any other times.
Yes.
Maybe just for season finales.
Yeah,
We'll see.
It was nice.
Okay, so I'm going to do a prayer. Dear Jesus, I come to you weary and burdened, thankful that you see me, know me, and meet me where I am. Forgive me for seeking fulfillment in things that cannot satisfy. I surrender my shame, struggles, and fears to you. Pour your living water into my life, refresh my soul, and fill my heart with your grace and truth. Give me courage to leave behind what holds me back and share your love with others. In your holy name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.